Welcome learners. Today we will be discussing about India-China conflict and cooperations. You might have been reading and watching on the television for last 1 year. There was a continuous conflict at Ladakh border. China intervened last year in March, which continued throughout the year, and then finally de-escalation process started almost after a year. So there are certain very normal questions which are being asked. Why did China do that? What was the purpose of China? How do we evaluate India-China relations? So there are many layers, there are many factors which we need to know about it. The first and the most important, we need to identify what is the Chinese threat perception against India. What is Indian threat perception against China? Is it only a matter of conflict, or is there any areas of a space for cooperation between the two countries? What is the involvement of the external power like America, like Pakistan, or many other European countries? How does the two countries see the international system, international institutions? Say, all these factors become very important when we discuss about India-China relations. To begin with, if you try to identify India-China cooperation, it started with a very strong emotional as well as a political feed. Almost both the countries, in terms of the population, largest and the second largest in the world, and they became a very independent political unit almost in the same time of the world arena. China came out to be a communist country, defeated the nationalists with a long struggle of almost 3 decades, and it came out as a special entity in China, which is called People's Republic of China. The birth of People's Republic of China in 1949. India, after clutches of the 200 years from the British Empire, became independent on 15 August 1947. So 1947 and 1949, both the countries had a very strong bondage, civilizational bondage also, crisscrossing, and they had an opinion. They had an opinion to move together and create a new identity in the world politics, and which was much talked about the Asian value system. Because if you try to identify the social structure of India and China, it is more or less same, completely different from the Western perspective, where society and family values are very important. Joint family structure was more or less the same. The Confucius philosophy matches with the Indian philosophical underpinnings. So more or less both the countries have the same outlook in terms of economics, because economy was very bad shape in 1947 and 1949 in China. The social structure was more or less same, and industrial conditions of the both countries were not very in good shape. So that is why these two countries were called the civilizational state as well. Civilizational state means it is not merely confined to the domain of the nation state. The perception and definition of the nation state is Western dominated. But when we talk about the civilizational state, it is a little different from the nation concept of the nation state, where the society plays a very important role, where the family values become very important. And that is why the long history of China, the long history of India, it is not merely birth of 1947 and 1949, it is a long trajectory. And that is why they wanted to move together to assert their joint venture in the world politics. But what did happen after 1949? it is before us, and that is how the two countries, despite becoming a good friend, they became a competitor, they became a rival and enemies. So what are the reasons of being enemies to each other? That is very important to identify. What is important to know about it? Why did these two largest countries of the world become rival to each other? How did it start? Who is responsible for it? These are the very important and fundamental questions which we need to explain and understand. The first, if you try to see the Chinese threat perceptions, why does China believe that India could be a threat to Chinese security? This is important. So there are many reasons for it. If you try to see, the thing started at very good note in the early 50s when India-China Vai concept, India-China brother concept emerged. And that is how in 1954 the theory of Panchsheel was created by a Chinese premier and accepted by India, and they both agreed to follow the 5 dictums while dealing with each other. But there is a contradiction in Chinese perceptions. On the one hand, it talked about a Panchsheel, but on the other hand, it has started intervening in Tibet from 1951. And that is how we see in a few years that Tibet was completely captured by China, and that created a bad blood between India and China. And as we know, the status of Tibet was a buffer zone. Buffer zone means India, China, the two largest countries. There were 2 buffer lines. One buffer line was Tibet as an independent unit. If you try to dig out the history and explain, for many 100 years, Tibet was an independent country. Even in 1947, the Asian Conference in which the Tibetan delegations participated, they participated as a member of the independent country. So the status of Tibet was completely sabotaged by China, and it was captured, and that demolished the one layer of buffer zone. The another layer of the buffer zone was Nepal, and that was also intervened by China, which we would later discuss. So this is one major problem which emerged from the Chinese behavior. Chinese strategic behavior was very aggressive from the beginning itself. India was very friendly, tried to protect the Chinese interest at multi-forum bodies. India took extra pain in introducing China, endorsing China as a very important country in the world system, whether it was membership to the United Nations or its struggle for a permanent membership in Security Council, in which India played a very important role. But on the other hand, China started pushing India, China started serving India in many ways, and that has created a concept of rivalry that given a space for conflict between the two countries. So China believed that we are talking about the Chinese threat perceptions. So according to Chinese calculus, that India is a neighboring country. India had, and still it believes that India has the potential to sabotage and challenge the Chinese authority, its power, strategic thinking, and that is why it is a competitor than a friend. And that is how its behavior over a period of time reflected the Chinese mindset. The second important threat perceptions of China against India was its another troubled areas is Xinjiang. As we all know that there is a boundary dispute between India and China which spans almost 4,078 kilometers from west to east, and Ladakh is where that border tussle between India and China continued in 2020, in the early 2021. So what do we see? The tri-junction means there is a point from where the roads are going to two difficult problem areas of China, that is Tibet and Xinjiang. And as India has made its service lane, Daulat Beg Oldi, the connecting road which has been built up over a period of time in the last few years, that showed that Indian forces now can move from that point to Xinjiang as well as to Tibet. And that is why China is very apprehensive about it. China thought if India has a stronghold in that particular point, it can steer unrest both in Tibet and Xinjiang. Third important threat perceptions of China against India is India-US relationship. It believes that, as we know the world politics, understand the world politics, militarily China and India are very important countries in this Asian world order. Whereas when we talk about the superpower, I believe that, and most of the strategic thinkers agree that still there is one country which is a superpower, that is America. China militarily is much inferior to the American power. Whereas India is definitely much inferior to the Chinese military power. But there is a catch here. America is located far away from the Chinese land. So China believes that all alone America cannot do much harm to China, whether in terms of military equipment, in terms of the nuclear and other way. And it also believes that India is not capable of targeting China because economically and militarily it is much smaller than the Chinese power. But China becomes apprehensive and susceptible to the joint venture of India and America. So if you see the history, what do we, at least the history of the 73 years, what do we infer, take the inferences from the joint venture of India and America? Whenever the two leaders of the two countries met and discussed, China had a very bad dream. China had a very bad days, and it thought something is going on against me. So that is the another threat perceptions of China against India. The fourth threat perception, the changing strategic policy of India during the NDA government in 1997 to 2001 and then after. So what do we see? When India tested the nuclear power in 1991, the Indian Prime Minister at the time, Sri Atal Bihari Vajpayee, wrote a letter to the American President explaining why did India undertake this nuclear test and blaming China for this, because India is surrounded by the two nuclear powers, two adversary nuclear powers, that is China and Pakistan, and that is how it was needed. We also have heard and seen that many of the Indian ministers at the time started calling China is enemy number one. The defense minister at the time, George Fernandez, said it is not Pakistan, it is not any other country, but it is China which is the enemy of India. So thought perceptions and a strategic calculus of India change from 1950 to 2001. And that is how China started believing that if in that trajectory is changing in India, it could be dangerous for China, and that is how we need to cut the size of India militarily and if possible economically. And these are the major threat perceptions of China against India. Now look at the vice versa. How does India perceive China? Why does India believe that China is enemy? China is a rival. China is a competitor. There are many factors of it. The first and important is boundary dispute. The boundary dispute, if you see the history of the Chinese boundaries, China had a boundary dispute with more than 27, 28 countries after 1949 till today. But most of the boundary dispute almost China has resolved, whether it was the Southeast Asian countries, whether it was with Russia, or whether it was with its immediate neighbor. But the boundary dispute with the two countries, India and Bhutan, remain unresolved. And that is why it has, in the beginning, it wanted to have a package deal. Package deal means which part of the area which is more vulnerable from the Chinese point of view, it wanted to take over. So in the first phase, it wanted to have eastern sector, that is Arunachal Pradesh, Nepal, and for that it wanted to give leverage to the western sector. But over a period of time, China changed the track. Now it started calling the western sector is more important. So the package deal of China is a very swinging factor, and it wanted to dominate over India. And it is not going as per the Panchshila agreement. It is not following any agreement which was undertaken earlier. So that is why India perceives that China is a threat. China is going to create more conflict on the border side. We had seen quite number of times the Chinese incursion, sometimes in the eastern sector, sometimes in the western sector, and 2017 it took on the middle sector, which is called Sikkim, the tri-junction between India, Bhutan and China. So this is a major threat which India perceives against India. The second important threat perception for India against China is China-Pakistan nexus. There is a continuous nexus between Pakistan and China against India. It started from early 60s. In 1963, Pakistan ceded a very important 5,000 square kilometer to China from the Pak-occupied Kashmir, and that is how China built up the roads and infrastructure. And you might have heard about the CPEC and China's OBR are moving on the same directions and trajectory, and that is how China became an integral part of South Asia, not merely moving into the Indian Ocean, but it also went in and around of other South Asian countries. So that is the second most important factor of China-Pakistan nexus, which created a threat for India. Even the nuclear test by Pakistan is all said and done that it was completely helped out by China. China provided each and everything for Pakistani nuclear arsenals. And in many other ways, the Gadar port, you might have been reading about it, hearing about it. How did China build up this Gadar port, and how is it going to be used against India? So all these factors in every domain, wherever China and Pakistan converges, they have one major aspect is anti-India, and it is seen, it is happening in different directions. That is why India believes that China is a threat. There are other threat perceptions. A string of pearls theory, you might have heard and read. What is all about it? China has been started expanding in the Indian subcontinent. The countries which are smaller in size, they have their own very old age friendship with India, because it is called Indian subcontinent. And Indian subcontinent means they are connected by land, by history, by culture. The South Asian countries which are more or less part of the SAARC. So China intervened in Bangladesh, China intervened in Nepal, Maldives, Sri Lanka. So all these countries came under the heat of China. Economically, they try to influence the political institutions of the respective countries and try to motivate them to go against India. And that is how we see in the Indian Ocean, they also expanded their feet, whether it was Myanmar or Maldives or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh. And this is how it built up a very strong forces against India, which is known as the string of pearls, so which is still in operation. So this is, again, India perceives on that note that China is a threat. Chinese nuclear arsenals, if you try to analyze the doctrine of Indian nuclear and Chinese nuclear, what do we see? China has in its doctrine no first use, but there is a clause and subclause of the doctrine, and it has collaborated that even if China perceives, not in real terms, perceives that a threat is emerging from India, so it can use a nuclear arsenal against India. And all we know where the Chinese nuclear arsenals are located. Some of its missiles are on the Tibetan Plateau, and major arsenals are located in Lopnor and other areas of Xinjiang, so which is not very far away from the Indian territory. So the complete Himalayan sphere has been laden with the nuclear missiles. Pakistan is again not very far away. India has also a nuclear. So the proximity of the nuclear arsenals and missiles are in such a close proximity in South Asia, especially in the Himalayan sphere, which give a jittery and creates a threat perceptions against China. There are many other factors. The Chinese economy is also, despite being a very close terms with India, means China is the largest trading partner for India. But apart from that, it has a strategy to weaken some of the sectors of India through its manipulations of economic tricks and check diplomacy and other factors you might have heard about it. Another threat perceptions which India believes that China is doing is instigating the internal affairs of India, like in the northeast part of India, which has been feeling the heat of the separatism, where the Chinese forces are involved, whether in terms of smuggled arms and ammunitions, our money, our other factors. China has been doing that. So these are the major threat perceptions from China to India and India to China. Now let us think about it. Is it only a merely a relation of conflict? So we could say that there are certain degree of conflict between the two countries are fine, but there is a huge possibility of cooperation as well between the two countries. What are the areas of the cooperation between the two countries? From the 1950s even till today, there are many areas of cooperation, and one of the cooperation is multilateralism. If you see the foreign policy of China and foreign policy of India of 50s and 60s and 70s, what do we see? Both the countries wanted to have a multilateral structure, multipolar world, not dictated by one country, as it has been done in the 20th century by Britain, our 21st century to large extent in 20th century and early 21st century by America, and still America is a dominant superpower. So China wanted to have a multilateral structure, India also wanted to have a multilateral structure, and they can share the power, which has not been done so far. So there is a convergence of interest of the two countries. But over a period of time, as China became important, China started rejecting the multilateral structure and wanted to dictate the terms as it has been done by Britain and America in their respective centuries. So this is one dualism, this is a contradictory approach of China in pursuing the multilateral structure. The second important area of cooperation is convergence of interest, like world issues, which is the very dominant in the world politics, like climate change. If you try to see the climate change which took place finally after a lot of cooperation, the Paris conference, where India and China stand on the same side, America and some of the European countries. And it has been said categorically that India and China are the two countries where the economic growth is desirable, economic growth is needed. And for economic growth, they need to have energy. And energy primarily emerge from the diesel, petrol, gas, and coal. So their economy is coal and gas driven, and which is required, and that is how the climate is being affected. And in creating a catastrophic situations of the climate, it is not China nor India are responsible for it. It is the Western countries, primarily America, in the 20th century and 21st century, they have created a huge amount of dirt and carbon monoxide in the atmosphere, which has become a threat for the humanity. So on that plank, both the countries are together and they can move together. So there is another synergy of interest between the two countries. The international organizations is the third areas where the two countries can move together and find out and establish a system where it could be helpful for all the countries of the world. But let us see, has China been doing it? Has China been moving along with India to challenge all these issues which have evolved, where it has created a space for synergy with India? Not at all. In terms of international organizations, what do we see? Not merely in UNO, but even WHO was manipulated. The pandemic occurred where WHO remained silent under the influence of China, did not come out with the report on time. Had it been done by WHO, it might have de-escalated the pandemic to a large extent. And this is how the Chinese behavior was seen. So more or less, what is the perception of China? China wants to be a superpower. It believes that it has reached near to the pinnacle, where its terms should be dictated, terms should be respected, and China should dictate the world system. Whereas India believes that it is not merely China which will have the power, it will be shared by many of the countries of the world, including India. So there is a difference of opinion, there is a difference of perceptions. So in that context, we need to learn India-China relations. There is a split, there is a conflict, but there is a synergy of cooperation between the two countries as well. Thank you very much.